Hey, can you guys see me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Hey,
Dan, so, so,
everybody.
so just to
Forget.
let everyone know, we're recording the Q&A section only for archival reasons. Dan, you're joining a group of book lovers and also philosophers, so I'm going to warn you. I'm just giving you a heads up here. We have our critical hats on, but also our grateful hats, because the book was very, very, very engaging. So thank you so much for joining us. Dan is traveling, and he contacted me out the blue a few days ago and was like, I hear you guys are reading my book. Can I join the group? And so we are just so appreciative that you decided to join us despite me traveling. So thanks so much.
Well, thanks a lot. I'm here in a dodgy hotel room in Florida, so forgive that my bad situation. But I'm glad to be here with Professor Cherry and her incredible group of people, and happy to answer any questions or here. My two favorite my two among the two most important categories of people who I like are philosophers and book club members. So I'm ready to take whatever you guys got for me. I'm ready to roll.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we've already did an overview of the book, and we're raising questions, and we got two hands up, and they are ready to go. So we'll go with Lisa first, and then we'll go with Alice.
Hi, and thank you so much for joining us. I had my hand up before you came, so I will now transform it into a question for you rather than a comment about the book.
Whatever works for you.
Yeah. So I'm someone who has lots of regrets, and I think I already use them in many of the ways that you described, but I also think about my regrets differently than you do, because I think that you focused on the instrumental value of regret, on how regret can make us better or make us do better, or make things better for us. And I think about regret also playing a role in telling us what is and isn't regrettable. But I don't think that role is direct. So, you include a lot of empirical information from studies about what people regret. But I'm interested in thinking about the gap between what people regret and what is regrettable in the sense of what merits regret. And I wonder if you thought about that gap at all, and whether, among the things that people do regret from the survey, are there things that people tend to regret that we might want to say are not truly regrettable, don't merit regret? And on what basis might we say that they don't merit regret if we're not just taking evidence of it meriting regret, from the fact that people do regret them?
Yeah, I think that's a really intriguing and insightful question, Lisa. Can I ask you a follow-up? Can you, just to make things a little bit, again, I'm dealing with philosophers, so I'm going to try to, and I'm more of a journalist, so I'm going to try to make things a little bit more concrete. But can you give me an example of what you're talking about? I think I have a sense of what you're talking about, but I want to make sure that I understand fully. So give me a sense of what, in your view, is something that is a regret that might not be regrettable.
Well, people might regret doing they might be wrong, like, for instance, in the category of moral regrets. They might be wrong about what's morally right and wrong, and they might regret having done something because they saw it as morally wrong, but it isn't. It was actually the right thing to do. And then we might want to regrettable. We would want to know on what basis we say it really wasn't morally wrong. And then in the other direction, so there are cases that philosophers like to talk about where there's where something bad as an outcome happened from a choice that one made, but it was due to luck. So
that's important.
Yeah. So, people may feel a kind of regret that they drove on that road, if in fact that was the road on which, there was a deer standing in the road and they hit the deer or something.
Exactly. It
was entirely due to luck. Is that something that isn't truly regrettable, or is it truly regrettable?
I think you're hitting on a really important point, and it's a point that actually, again, in my view, as someone who knows the literature in social psychology and economics far better, believe me, far better than the literature in philosophy. But I think that what you're getting at here is, in some levels, I think it's a lot of really, really interesting, profoundly important issues about how we guide our lives. But I think one of the most important issues you're going to is essentially agency. Where do we have agency and where do we not have agency? And that ends up being, I think, I didn't realize it until doing this research, Lisa, that ends up being a profoundly important question about how do you fashion a good life? And I think that in some level, we actually overestimate how much agency we have. And in other cases, we underestimate how much agency we have. And so a couple of things here. Number one, I'm going to go back to the epilogue of the book, which is, I think, a sort of a philosophical question, where I raise a philosophical question of sorts, where I ask people this pretty basically philosophy 101 question of, like, do people have free will? And most of the people in my sample said yes. And then I asked, basically the reverse of that, which is, do we live in a fatalistic universe? And people said, does everything happen for a reason? And people said, yes. That is, both people, the vast majority, I'm not talking about a small majority, I'm talking about 3/4 of people said, yes, I have agency, I have free will, and everything happens for a reason. And I think that ends up sort of surfacing a pretty important question about our lives. Where do we have say and where do we not? And I don't think there's a clear answer to that question, but I think that interrogating our regrets begins to give us clues about that. So if you make a decision, okay, so that's one thing. So there's a big difference between something being your fault and something being circumstance or luck. And I think that simply the act of interrogating that is a healthy act. What's more is that if you look at some of the research, again, I'm skittish here because I actually just coincidentally on the plane ride over here where I am, I read a book by a philosopher. So I read most of a book by a philosopher at the New School. So I'm in sort of philosopher mode, and that is just not how my mind works. My mind works. I'm much more of a philosophy is very hard for me to keep in my head. I'm much more of basically almost like a biologist, essentially. It's like, let me pin this butterfly and then start and extract its DNA and try to figure out what the hell is going on here. But I do think there is a tendency for human beings to be outcomists. That is, we evaluate our decisions based on the outcome that they created rather than the decision itself. So I think that what regret teaches us is interrogating, asking the question of where we have agency and where we don't, and also asking ourselves the question of, when we evaluate a decision, let's evaluate the decision, let's evaluate the process, and let's make the outcome essentially irrelevant. So I'm not sure that I feel like I was sort of like, I feel like I'm dancing a little bit in response to your question, but tell me what you think of that, Lisa.
I'm going to yield to Myisha to tell me whether I should speak, because I know other people have their hands up, but I want to keep going.
Okay, we'll take these two questions, and if there's time, then we'll come back to the exchange.
Yeah, but it is a profoundly important question of really thinking about, where do we have agency? Where do we have the capacity to shape our world, our own future, and where are we simply less? Again, I can use this word with philosophers: less agentic individuals who are subject to forces, structural and systemic forces larger than we can control. That's a profoundly important question. I don't think, I mean, again, if we were to reconvene here in 30 years, I don't think we're going to have anywhere closer to the answer to that.
All right, Alice.
That's okay. That's a very flattering mix-up. Thank you. So first of all, thank you so much for the book and for agreeing to be with us this evening. This is a really extraordinary
My pleasure. It's a pleasure.
I was glad to hear you bring up the coda, because that's what I wanted to ask you about. So I'm glad to know that you want to talk about that. I was really intrigued by your use.
I'm glad you made it. I'm glad you made it to the coda, Alex. Most members of my own family did not make it to the coda.
Yeah, no, I'm sure my family doesn't make it anywhere near the end of what I write. I wanted to ask you about your use of Dan McAdams' contamination sequences and redemption sequences.
Nice.
And
Okay, let's
particularly
go.
your line that that regret offers us the ultimate redemption narrative. I was really struck by that. Partly this is sort of my own thing and what I tend to think about and write about. I write a lot about apologies and sort of what makes for a good or apology or a bad apology. What are some of the risks or dangers of them? And I'm really struck by the ways in which redemption narratives are very enticing and very appealing. And I think they can sometimes be a little bit dangerous as a result. We like the story of a redeemed wrongdoer. We love it in our films and movies and fiction and also in our own lives, and it's who we root for, and it's very appealing in our own lives to see ourselves as the sort of redeemed anti-hero. But when I read it, I was like, oh yeah, that's true. And then it also got me thinking about something I'd been thinking about throughout the book, and that's the way you describe regret. It seems like it's something to be metabolized for good. It's like a warning signal that tells us how we can fix our life, and then we fix our life and then it goes away. But I found myself thinking, like, that's a appealing redemption narrative, but it strikes me that it's not always true. Someone, and I can't remember the name before you arrived, was talking about how sometimes, you fix the problem, you make amends, you reconnect, you take the risk, you correct the wrong, but you still feel the regret. And part of me wants to say, I obviously don't want people to be completely frozen in the past, but there might be something good about about continuing just to sit with regret, to carry your regrets, to know them. And I worry about framing the value of regret in terms of its role in a redemption narrative. I think that sets us up for sort of a particular kind of moral story or personal story, and a particular kind of what you're supposed to do with it that might not fit a lot of really important cases. And so I was just curious about your thoughts on that.
I think it's a great point, Alice. And I actually think that it connects to Lisa, because what I'm hearing is that a little bit of a pushback on the idea of the instrumental value of regret. That is, I think what you're making is in some ways a deeper case for the value of regret in and of itself, irrespective of any instrumental value it might hold. And that is not a case that I made. And I think it's an extremely interesting case. I think the other thing that you've surfaced there is another, again, just profoundly important point, which is that I'll give you an example. So there's a very interesting popular book that came out about 3 years ago called Useful Delusions. It's by Shankar Vedantam. Some of you might know his podcast, Hidden Brain. I can see a lot of nodding here. So Shankar Vedantam wrote a book about useful delusions. And the idea is that we are not always clear-eyed in our assessments of ourselves or our assessments of the people we care about. And that might be okay. In fact, that might actually be, and again, the biologist in me is that might actually be adaptive. And so the idea of viewing our lives as a redemption narrative might not be true in the way that you, Alice, are talking about it, but it might be adaptive. That it might actually be useful, that it might actually enhance our well-being. It might be something that Shankar is talking about, akin, first cousin of a useful delusion. Let me give you an example of that. Let's think. So if you were to, I'll give you an example of a useful delusion. So let's take any kind of marriage. All right. We know in America that roughly 50% of any marriage is going to end in divorce. But when people on their wedding day, no matter, again, whether it's 2 men, 2 women, 1 man and a woman, whatever, very few people on their wedding day say, you know what? I'm going to be the half where this marriage completely craps out. All right. Most people on their wedding day say, you know what? This is going to last forever. And that delusion might be useful. It might actually help them cement that. If you look at the way that parents view their kids, parents are absolutely delusional about their kids. And that might be adaptive. And so I think what you're getting at perhaps is the difference between what is adaptive and what is true. And that is a fascinating and profoundly important question. And as someone who writes more in the realm of psychology, biology, and economics, I tilt a little bit to team adaptive. But as a philosopher, you might tilt a little bit more toward team true. And I think it's a fascinating tension.
Alina?
I'm just trying to find a way to lower my hand. Hi, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us. I'm Kalina. I'm a psychologist here on campus. I direct the Kind Lab, and we study empathy and fear in kids using neuroimaging methods. So I love that you referenced the work of some of my colleagues, Sonia Lubomirski's work and others.
Sure.
Nice to
Oh,
see.
right. Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess maybe this goes back to your question about agency. And one of the things that I was thinking about throughout your book, one thing I was thinking about is how do kids learn about regret? But the other thing that I was looking for and interested in is surely there must be individual differences. And one of the things that I was surprised by in your book, that there are quite few individual differences in the kinds of regrets that people have, the frequency of regrets that people have. But one of the ones that you highlighted was that people, I think you mentioned that people with college degrees have more career regrets. And what you explained is that this was because their life presents more opportunities to them. And so given more opportunities, you might have a wider array of opportunities that then you could, you have a larger universe of foregone opportunities. And so that made me think that, some of these pathways that you describe might be available to fewer people, that the environment interacts with personality, or environment interacts with aspects of your personality, and then just disadvantages people further because they have fewer opportunities. So I was wondering how you thought about these sort of environmental effects on the development of regret, and then subsequently on what people do with that choice.
Yeah, it's another very interesting question. I have to say, I just want to be clear that in the American Regret Project, which was the quantitative survey, we did find that difference. One of the relatively few demographic differences. That is, as exactly as you say, Kalina, the people with higher levels of formal education had more career regrets. Now, why that's happening is pure speculation. I just want to be clear. I'm speculating why that might be. I'm speculating why that might be the case. But once again, what you guys are surfacing, this should be like the meta book club, not like Meta the company, but like the sort of the meta in terms of just sort of getting to the essence of the issue. I think what you're talking about is essentially the meta of the entire field of social psychology. I mean, as you know, as a social psychology, which is that, what matters the most? Is it the person or the situation? And what we know is that the answer to that question is it the person or is it the situation? The answer is yes. All right. The answer is it's the interaction of the person and the situation. So I do think that there's pretty good evidence that regret is part of our cognitive machinery, that it's part of what it means to be a human being in any kind of social circumstance. That said, like anything else in our biology, whether it is introversion or height or intelligence or anything like that, the way that attribute is, or the way that tendency, that trait, that attribute is going to express itself is going to hinge in part on the situation that you're in. So it's possible that that people with less formal education, with fewer options, could have fewer regrets. But that's not necessarily obviously it's not a good thing, because going back to Lisa's question, what it might say is that people in those kinds of situations feel like they don't have agency. What this could be is a situation that the more privilege you have, the more agency you feel. And the more agency you feel, the more likely it is you're going to experience a regret. And so if you're in a circumstance where you don't feel agency, you might not feel regret. That's not a good thing. The fundamental problem is that there are many, many people in the world who don't feel a sense of agency. So I'm not sure that perfectly. That's more. Come back to me, Kalina, because I'm not sure I perfectly answered your.
Yeah, no,
sure
I appreciate that. I want to think about that some
Yeah.
more. That's great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Almond?
I want to take a step back and question something that you mentioned at the beginning. I like it's the overall thing.
Yeah, lay it on me.
Why is there such an obsession with having no regrets? If, as you say, regrets is part of our biology.
I think it's a good question, Halma. Again, another really good question. I think part of it is that here I think there's more of a cultural explanation. Again, if we're trying to sort of divine who human beings are and why they do what they do, as Kalina is saying, a lot of it is at we're talking about, in some level, we're talking about intersections here. The intersection of the person and the situation. The idea that, yes, we have agency, but we don't have full agency. Yes, we are subject to circumstance, but we're not completely the hostage of circumstance. But here, I think we tilt a little bit more toward culture and circumstance and situation. And I think it's largely because I think it's a very American thing, because I don't think it's universally true, that here in America, we have in part been sold a bill of goods. We have been kind of told and indoctrinated that we should be positive all the time, that we should never be negative, that we should look forward and never look back. And that, even though it's superficially appealing, ends up being a pretty crappy recipe for effective living. Now, you guys are all talking about emotions, and I think that one of the things that Americans haven't fully reckoned with is the fact that we have positive emotions and we have negative emotions. And these emotions exist in large part because they are adaptive. And so the idea that you would have only positive emotions is foolish. I think that the pathway to a healthy and fulfilling life is more positive emotions than negative emotions. But I don't think that it's only negative. I don't think it's only positive emotions. I think that's foolish. I think that's actually dangerous. Let's take, I wrote about this. Take an emotion like fear. Fear is a negative emotion. Okay, I don't like experiencing fear, but would I subject myself to an operation where some, doctor would eradicate my ability to experience fear? Hell no, because if I'm in a burning building, if the dodgy hotel that I'm here in Florida is on fire, I want to experience fear because I want to get my ass out of here. And so I just think that in America, especially, we've been sold this bill of goods that we should be positive all the time. And that's just not a recipe for healthy living. And I think that, just to be fair, what we haven't done, perhaps because we don't have enough philosophy majors, perhaps because we're uncomfortable dealing with this, is that we haven't given people the tools to how do we reckon with negative emotions. And I think that we're seeing a lot of the consequence of that. We're seeing the consequence of that with this incredible depth of mental health issues, and the sense that there are many people in America who, for completely non-material reasons, are not flourishing. So I think what we need to do is, one, reckon with, like, what is the human condition? The human condition is positive and negative. And also that there are systematic ways that both, again, there is this kind of, you guys are making me think about this kind of synergy between some of the principles of philosophy and some of the principles of what we know about both psychology and neuroscience. So if you look at certain philosophical traditions, they're very much in tune with, say, something like cognitive behavior therapy, which we know is good for people. So get past the idea that positive is the only thing, and then also equip people, whether it's through cognitive behavior therapy, whether it's a study of philosophy, with how do I systematically deal with the fact that negative emotions, unpleasant emotions, are part of living. I think the no regrets Hallman, the no regrets philosophy is this very kind of performative whistling past the graveyard approach that is, I think, profoundly unhealthy.
Anna?
There's still time for me. Great. Yeah, that's really cool that you are here as an author. So I would ask you the
It's
question.
really cool that you read the book, man.
Yeah, even though I didn't agree that much as you might wish.
Fantastic.
So
My favorite kind of reader.
Good. So my question is, what is your stance about cases where people feel regret that, for example, they regret that they didn't finish their studies, so took educational chances, but we, as sort of observers, see that their counterfactual reasoning is just wrong. This is not the reason why their life is not comfortable. So if they have this sort of strange idea, if I would have finished my studies, then everything would have been great. But I would say, no, you would be as miserable as you are right now.
Okay, I think it's another really brilliant question. And again, it goes to this fundamental point, where is that when we, again, fundamentally at the core of all of this is, where do we have agency and where do we not have agency? And if you go through your life thinking that you are in control of all of your outcomes, that everything that the circumstances of your life are fully 100% in your control, you are going to be miserable. At the same time, if you go through your life and say that the circumstances of I'm completely, I have no agency at all, I think that you're going to be miserable. I think that what's important is questioning that. And I think that one of the things that when we think about our regrets is asking the very question that you're asking, which is that looking at the counterfactual based on the decision itself at the moment you made the decision, not whether the outcome was good or bad. I think that's a fundamental part of good living and actually clear thinking. I can give you another book recommendation on this. It's another popular book. It's a very interesting writer named Annie Duke. I mean, it might actually work for this course. I don't know, or for your book club. As a woman named Annie Duke. Annie Duke started as a psychology PhD. She was actually a classmate of John Haidt, who is a moral psychology scholar. And she ended up leaving because of some health problems and ended up going to play professional poker because she felt like professional poker was an avenue toward understanding human behavior. And she became a very accomplished professional poker player. But what she has a very interesting book called Thinking in Bets, which really says that what we have to try to do is focus on the decision itself, not on the outcome. A bad decision through a bad process that leads to a positive outcome is not instructive. A good decision that leads to a negative outcome is actually instructive. And so again, what I think that one of the beneficial effects of regret, again, leaving aside the very, very fair criticism that maybe we don't want to see regret as this completely instrumental thing, but making it instrumental here for a moment. One of the values of actually thinking about our regrets and scrutinizing our regrets is that it allows us to evaluate the decision, all right, the counterfactual decision, not the counterfactual outcome. And when we establish that habit, I think we actually live better. I think the trouble is that many people are not rigorous. So they think that, so what they assume is that a good outcome is the product of a good decision, and a bad outcome is the product of a bad decision. And that is absolutely not the case.
And there were some questions before you came, and also questions in the chat that's kind of related. And so I wanted to throw this question to you.
Yeah.
So some people were wondering, what is the connection or perhaps the difference between regret and guilt and or nostalgia?
And what was the third one?
Nostalgia.
Oh, interesting. Nostalgia. Okay. So, wow. All right. Rock and roll. So, so the way that I look at this is, it's a very, very interesting question. So the way that I look at this is guilt is in some ways a subset of regret. That guilt is in a way is, I think, similar to a moral regret. I think it might affect some of those, what I call the connection regrets too. That is, guilt is essentially, I did a bad thing. It's not like, oh, I never studied abroad. People don't feel guilt about that. I never asked Bob out on a date. People don't feel guilt about that. But I think that guilt is a regret that has a moral component, recognizing all the complexities of what morality actually is. Now, nostalgia, that's interesting because that's a totally different kettle of fish here. As it happens, young men and women, I wrote about nostalgia in a previous book, a book called When, which is about the science of timing. And one of the things that I discovered there was that nostalgia is actually better for us than we think. That nostalgia is not, in psychological terms, what nostalgia is not. What's interesting, when nostalgia first came as a concept, I think it was like in the late 1800s in Switzerland, it was deemed a mental disorder. This idea that, oh, I'm yearning for this past that I once had. It was deemed as like a mental disorder. And what we know is that nostalgia is actually adaptive. Now, once again, with your very insightful questions, it goes to the question that came up, I think it was Alice came up with, which is, there are things that are true and there are things that are adaptive. And nostalgia might be more adaptive than true. And here's the thing, guys, again, I'm going to be heretical in a group of philosophers. I like things that are adaptive because I want people to get through the day.
And tell us a little bit more about how I'm gonna read the book. I'm gonna read When, but tell us a little bit how nostalgia is adaptive, because I'm very nostalgic. So I want to know.
Okay, so nostalgia. Okay, great question. So nostalgia is adaptive in the sense that I think is that it gives a kind of coherence to our lives. All right. What it makes us believe is that what came before is connected in some way to what is happening now. That I look back on my childhood and say, oh my, I'm completely confecting this, you guys. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. Okay. I had a totally like whatever childhood. All right. Not horrible, not great, whatever. All right. But I can have a nostalgic view of my childhood growing up in Central Ohio, saying, oh my God, it was so delightful on summer evenings, chasing after fireflies, going to baseball practice and playing with my beloved teammates, and coming back from practice and maybe walking past the Dairy Queen and getting a small vanilla cone and then swatting fireflies along the way. And I have this kind of warm glow of a feeling, in part because it brings coherence to my life, because I look back on that and say, wait, the person who I am today was fashioned in part by that experience. And I feel, and I want to feel good about the person who I am today. So in that sense, nostalgia is in that sense, I think nostalgia is adaptive. It is, I think psychologically, I think what the research shows pretty clearly is that is a little counterintuitive, which is that nostalgia is actually not a bad thing. That looking backward and feeling good about your life brings coherence to the present, and that enhances well-being.
Lisa, do you want to close out with your response/question?
Are you asking me?
Yep.
Oh. I haven't thought that much about nostalgia, honestly. But I'll go back to the regret and the question of things being right versus being adaptive. I mean,
yeah.
What's interesting is that they are different from each other, but they are related to each other. So that I think that we construct what is right about certain things, at least what's morally right, for instance, out of what our actual emotions are. But there's no like one-to-one relationship there, so that we can also be wrong about things. And many of our emotions are we have because they are adaptive. I mean, that just simply has to be the case.
Absolutely. There's no question. Yeah.
So these two things can come into conflict, but we also see much more of a relationship between them. so that something we would not be able to say that something is right, for instance, if it was a wild mismatch with what people ever felt about it. Because I do think that our emotions are the source of our evaluative takes on things, including what's morally right and wrong. So there's a relationship between these two. It's not just that they always pull in opposite directions, but maybe the interesting cases are where they pull in opposite directions. And then we want to figure out how we can say that something's rightness diverges from what our adaptive emotions tell us about it.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, it's, again, I think you guys are hitting on some pretty fundamental points. I think that is a lesson of I think all these things are lessons of living. Where do we have control? Where do we not have control? How much, when we look at our own behavior and the behavior of others, how much is the person? How much is the situation? How much do we want to know? Where do we make the trade-off between truthfulness and adaptivity? And that's these are tough existential questions. I don't think that there's a clear, easy answer to all of these things. What I think is, again, I'm obviously biased, is that the emotion of regret gives us an avenue into asking some of these fundamental questions about living. And that's why I don't want us to be allergic to it. That's why I don't want us to resist it. What I want us to do is lean into it and have the kind of robust, interesting conversations that you all are having right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us. Thank you all so much I know it's late on the East Coast. It's 5 o'clock here and I had to work out before today's session to give you energy. Thank
This
you
is
all
awesome.
so much.
I've enjoyed this. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for reading the book. I really enjoyed this conversation. You made me, I'm going to have a hard time sleeping because I'm going to be thinking too much.
Good thing. Thank you so much. And this, once again, the book club is co-sponsored with Sell Your Books. We have Linda. Linda, do you want to say some words before we go? No, she's sick. Yes, her voice is messed up. But thank you so much for co-sponsoring this event with us. And we look forward to seeing you next month, April the 11th, as we talk about the shame machine. And then in May, Expressively Human. All right. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.
Bye, everyone.